job interview is one of the most anxiety-provoking situations most people can find themselves in, even when they go to plan. But what happens when you have your worst interview ever? Our guests share their worst interviews ever in the hope that you will take something from their mistakes to have a more successful interview outcome. Some of the stories are horrific and some are just downright embarrassing. Let's join our host, Kevin O'Reilly, the interview skills coach with over 25 years experience in the fields of coaching and recruitment. Let's welcome our guests to the show.
Welcome to another episode of My Worst Job Interviews Ever. With me, your host, Kevin O'Reilly, the interview skills coach. Did you know that the interview process is one of the main barriers to most individuals changing jobs? This show is for anyone who has an interview or is wanting to prepare for one in the future. Our guests have been there, done that, and are still doing it at the top levels of business. And they want to share their experiences so that we can learn and get the job or career that we deserve. Some are really unbelievable and some are just outright embarrassing. Today we have on the show Justine Gillespie. Justine is an equality, diversity and inclusion expert and runs her company Justine Gillespie Consulting. With over 30 years experience in HR across many different sectors, she has also been nominated for a Women's NE Business Award, and she's been shortlisted for an Inclusive Employer Award, LGBT Safe Space Award, and Inclusive Employers Staff Network Award. Justine, that is a mouthful. Congratulations on all of that and very well done. So where do we find you today, Justine?
Well, first of all, it's lovely to be here, Kevin. You find me sat in my home office, and I live pretty much equal distance between Sunderland and Newcastle.
Lovely, lovely. And for our viewers who are looking, that is quite a background you have. It's a wonderful space that you're in.
Yes, it's at the bottom of the garden. It's where we do also come to relax. It actually does, you'll probably see, has a little bit of a bar at the far end as well. But strictly not before 6 o'clock at night.
Okay. Well, you know what they say, it's 6 o'clock somewhere all the time.
Well,
So it depends on where your clock is. Well, thank you very much for coming on today. Okay. But before we get into the question of why we're really here, of telling us about your worst job interview ever, tell us a little bit about yourself and something that potentially no one or very little people know about you.
I, at the age of 54, have started to learn to play the drums. I have always been a massive rock music fan, and it's only since I left in paid employment to start working for myself did I think it was time to take up this and see if I could really do it. So I've been having lessons for the past couple of months, and I quite simply love it more than I can possibly say. And in my dreams, I am the drummer in some ancient rock band somewhere. You never know, maybe in a year's time I will be.
Well, I was just going to ask, is this the plan, is to move forward into a rock band and maybe see you sitting on stage at the back somewhere? Oh, you never know.
Well, you've got to have a dream. I think my teacher at the moment probably would say that we've got a little bit of practice to do before I get there. But what I can say is I am thoroughly enjoying it, and I'm also finding it's really good for the mind, because I'm very conscious that I sometimes get quite bad brain fog.
Yep.
And it really makes you quite mindful, because you've got to almost disconnect your limbs from each other, and they operate separately. So I'm finding that it's really quite good at sharpening your thoughts. It's really good.
I suppose that is a really good way, because you have to be present in the moment to have every limb doing something different.
Exactly that.
And you can't think about that, because if you think
No.
about it, it logically doesn't work.
No.
I
It's
suppose
harder when you overthink it, and actually a lot of it is a bit more sort of, natural. But yeah, it's been more than I expected. I've loved every second of it.
Is it an electric drum set, or is it the proper drum set?
No, the teacher has 2 electric drum sets side by side, and we listen to each other through headphones. And I have asked my husband, I've already asked for it on my Christmas list, Because at the moment I just have a plastic pad or a rubber pad to practice on, but it's just not the same. There is a lot that comes from the joy of hearing the different noises. So actually playing with no noise whilst you can practice the rhythms isn't doing it for me.
No, I think you need to have everything there, don't you, with regard to the sound, the feeling,
Exactly.
the touching, everything.
Yeah.
It's definitely something that my son, actually, my one of my sons had been playing drums for quite some time, was really enjoying it. We got him a drum set, but it was the electric drum
Yes.
set, and then he just fell out of love with it for
Oh,
for a similar reason, because he
very
couldn't
interesting.
really hear it.
That's very interesting. Okay.
Yeah, no, I know that they say that if you love it, you'll find a way, but
Yeah.
he just, as soon as we got the set, that was it.
Well, I might email you later to see if it's for sale.
They were actually quite a good set. They were, I had a wee go myself. I would like to say I'm ambidextrous, but I can do nothing with both hands if that's the case, you know, and drums was not it. I couldn't get my feet to do what they were told, and I couldn't get my hands to do the opposite of what they were told.
No,
So, yeah,
I
I
agree.
mean that's great, and I think it's testament to you that, you know, you've started your own consultancy firm, and now you're taking on a new sort of direction, even with regards to music, learning something new.
Yeah.
That is superb. It's very difficult to do at any age,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. And
you,
I've hidden away from doing it because there is that sort of thing in your mind about, why would I learn to play the drums? But actually, why not? So
that's it.
yeah.
That's it. And I think that's a great takeaway already. Is why would you not learn to play the drums?
Yeah.
I think that's the question everybody needs to ask. Why would I not?
Yeah. Why not? Yeah.
Yeah, why not? Absolutely. Okay. Okay. Well, listen, with that said, I'm sure what you're going to say on this journey that you've been on to get you to where you are now, this is going to be a bit of a roller coaster, I feel. I think we're going to really enjoy this today. So,
I think so.
listen, Justine, over to yourself. Tell us how this all began. Where did this love for HR, where did this love for people and diversity and equality and
Yeah.
inclusion all come from?
It's a really straightforward journey, and I always wanted to work in HR from a very early age. But if I was to explain what my mind was saying to me at the time, it was because I loved people, and obviously, as you uh, go through work, you realise that actually loving people isn't the most essential ingredient to being a good and effective HR person. But that was where it started. My mum and dad were both teachers, and I thought about going into teaching, but I think I'd always had an affinity with people and how I communicated with them, and so I thought HR would be where to go. I did a work experience with somebody from British Gas when I was when do you do work experience? 15, 16.
Yeah.
And she just really devoted that 2 weeks to really helping me understand what HR was about, and perfectly confirmed what I wanted. So when it came to choosing a degree, again, it was very straightforward. I'm old enough to be around for when it was polytechnics, and polytechnics were very much focused on providing an industrial placement where you got practical work experience during your degree, because I wasn't particularly academic. Um, so I didn't get fantastic grades. So I was navigated towards a polytechnic at the time. And I went and did a business studies degree which specialised in HR. And then during my industrial placement, I'd always worked in retail from the age of 16, British Home Stores and Boots. Um, and then thought, I'll work in retail. That's very much where I will do best. So got an industrial placement at a food retailer, and then went back to them as a graduate trainee within HR. So I was always very clear about what I wanted, and then just set my sights on finding out graduate recruitment programs that were going to help me fulfill that. And that was the start of it. I very quickly, within about 2 years of becoming a graduate trainee, got a regional HR role. and then just moved industries. Initially, I moved to be close to my husband because we decided we want to get married when we both graduated. We were in different areas of the country, so that was one reason why I moved organisations. And then continued within retail doing a variety of HR roles. And what I realised at that time was I believe that self-awareness is your greatest strength. And I started to understand what I was good at and where I could impact best. So I realised that I was not best in really strategic roles, that actually what I was very good at was sort of tactical, converting the strategy into action. So I've always been in sort of mid to senior roles without actually taking that final step, but that's because I knew that wasn't what I would enjoy. So that's why I've been very comfortable in the sort of trajectory that I've been on. And then after a number of retail roles, I moved into hospitality, finally ending up within the higher education sector. I'd always had a passion for social justice. Again, that was something that started at an early age. My dad thrust a Nelson Mandela badge into my hand when I was about 12 and said, "You need to find out about this man." And again, just somebody showing an interest and giving me some information led me on a path. But specialist equality, diversity, inclusion roles really have only been a recent change and development within industry. So when I joined the higher education sector, I was head of HR, but I was also responsible for EDI, but it was part of the job rather than the whole job. And then about 5 years ago, a specialist equality, diversity, inclusion role, the head of, became available. And that's when I had the greatest 5 years of my career. And it's quite simply, and I've thought about this so much, why was I so happy? And it was because it was the perfect marriage of the values of the employer matching my personal values whilst doing a job that was all about my values. And
Yeah.
so when those three things came together, it was effectively a marriage made in heaven. And it was the greatest 5 years of my whole career. And it's why I've now decided to make EDI my specialism from a personal perspective.
And do you think potentially as well, just touching back on something you said earlier about helping people, do you think there's a little bit of that within that last 5 years of that work of your work? Because it seems to be that is the center of that particular post.
100%. And it's why, I loved working in HR, but there are elements to HR, of course, that where the difficult decisions have to be made, and where you're carrying out work that affects people in a negative way. There's no question. Now, whilst EDI requires often some quite difficult conversations, ultimately it's about making people, educating people, and breaking down barriers for people. So the work tends to be more positive and, yes, helping people feel included in an organisation. So, yes, it was that perfect job of helping people, but also being quite complex as well, which is something that I also enjoy.
How do you interview for a role like that? Because it's
Really
quite
cool.
new. Because it's quite a new role. How is someone as an interviewer sitting on this panel, looking across at you, thinking, "Here are particular questions that I would like to ask to ascertain if that person sitting in front of me can do this role," particularly when it's such a new post?
That's such a good question, and also something I thought about a lot, because after the first 3 years in the role, I was then able to take on staff to work for me. And I thought long and hard because, as you said, in some roles, HR is a good example. There's a CIPD qualification that indicates a certain level of education, but that doesn't necessarily apply, as you said, within the EDI field. And likewise, when I took this job on 5 years ago, I didn't have any qualifications other than my complete and utter passion to address social injustices. So I actually decided that I would focus on it being a values-based interview. So I um, asked people to explain what issues in society existed, what barriers existed for people, and what they had personally done to challenge um, those sorts of scenarios within the context that they had operated in. Um, EDI also requires difficult conversations, trying to often bring together people with polarized opinions. So being able to manage difficult conversations is also useful. So I actually asked them about that as well. How would you manage? So it was very behavioral, and it was also very values based rather than competency based.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And have you found that, especially with your line of work within HR, that the majority of companies had reverted to a competency-based interview because they potentially think that past behavior is a reflection of future behavior? In most cases, that is an accurate statement, but not in all cases, because we're individuals and we change, we grow, we diversify.
Yeah. It's interesting because the two organisations that I've spent the longest with, both 12 years, one focused completely on fit. It was 100% values-based interview. And the one in higher education, 100% focused on capability and experience. And I still to this day don't know necessarily if there is a better one. I think it depends on the organisation, and that's something that I would think about. So the the retailer that I worked for 12 years was lived and breathed its values. So therefore, having people that suited that organisation was very important. They felt that you could train somebody on any skill, but you couldn't train them how to be good with a customer. And an example is, with it being a very informal organisation, if you sort of turned up for the second interview still wearing a suit and tie, they would question whether you got the culture or not. So that was an interesting thing. And that was over 20 years ago, which is very interesting. The organisation I worked for latterly never focused on potential. It was all about, could you do the job now? And was that better or worse? I don't know, because it suited that organisation. So I think the interview process really should reflect your organisation. So within the higher education industry, you can't necessarily make really spontaneous decisions because there are committees you have to go through, there are people you have to negotiate with. So somebody who completely disregards rules would find it very difficult to enjoy working there, and get very frustrated. So it's an interesting one. I don't know whether values based or capability behavioural is better. I think it depends on your organisation and what you're trying to reflect.
Well, I suppose if we even go one step further and say potentially it depends on the job role you're going for, because I know that I would like my doctor to be very qualified, very skilled, and be able to do the job as soon as he starts or she starts.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But, as you quite rightly said, their skills can be taught. Certain skills, most, if not all skills, can be taught. But changing an attitude, a lifelong attitude on lifelong values, is a very different beast altogether. And I always have this conversation with organizations that I would go into consult and support. And it's about trying to understand what it is they actually want. When I've asked the question of, why do you have this particular question? And there's potentially only 4 or 5 questions during an interview. Why do you have this question in? Usually the answer is, because that's the way we've always done it.
Always done it.
And I always reply with, well, if you always did what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And they will just look at me as if I have 2 heads and I've said something in a foreign language.
Yeah.
But once you really break that down and understand what it is that organization is trying to achieve, do they need people who can hit the ground running like all organizations claim they need and want? Potentially. Figures have shown that it takes 6 months for any employee, even the absolute amazing employees, to get up to speed just with the culture within the organization.
Yeah.
And I'm also sort of wondering, is this why they have this 6 months probationary period in most organizations? It's for both, actually. It's not just for the employer, but it's also for the employee to decide, was this a good move in the first instance?
Yeah.
Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But with your experience in HR as well, I'm sure you've sat on that side of the table and looked across and thought, what is happening here? Why is this person telling me this story and it is absolutely irrelevant to the question that I have just asked? I tend to find that people who haven't properly prepared tend to go off on that tangent because they feel like they need to give as much information. I call it the word vomiting. So they almost just vomit everything at you all at once and then hope something of what they said meets what you're looking for. And it's very difficult sitting here as an interviewer, looking across that table, knowing that person is more than capable of doing the job, because sometimes they're internal candidates. You know they're very capable of doing the job, but they just can't communicate that. And sometimes I find it a little bit challenging when they say, I have great communication skills, and then don't communicate. Now,
That's why I say self-awareness is your greatest strength.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Be
I
aware of
completely agree. Yeah, completely agree with that. As in, if you know what you're good at, great. Exploit that. Go with what you're good at. Have somebody else point out your blind spots, because they're blind for a reason. You can't see them.
Absolutely.
Have somebody else have a look over what you're doing, rehearse with you, and then decide, hold on a wee second, there's something just doesn't sit quite right. Because if you're going in blind, if you're going in not knowing what areas you could improve on, it's going to be very, very difficult for everybody, including you, but everybody in that room. Because I don't know about you, whenever I was sitting on panels, I was paid to be on that panel and nothing else. But other people on that panel had other things to do, didn't necessarily want to be there. So they wanted to get that interview over as quickly as possible, find the right person as quickly as possible, and get on with what they technically get paid to do. Did you find that yourself?
Yes, and I would say as an HR professional, it's one of the most frustrating things that I experience is when you are recruiting people, it's effectively the most important job that you are going to carry out, regardless of what your day-to-day job is. And people should really front load the amount of time they spend on the process. And, particularly if I look at it from an inclusive point of view, you really need to take time, as you said right at the beginning, to think about what it is you want this person to do, what type of person you want to do, how is the advert going to reflect the job, how is it going to reflect our culture, have I even put enough time in between them being able to apply, to shortlisting, to interview. And what we find is that often very little time is put into the prep for the interview by the interviewers themselves. It's a rushed decision, and then we make mistakes about who we then appoint. And I really do encourage people to put much more emphasis on the importance of getting it right, and spending quality time getting it right, including the interview process itself, or the interview, whatever it is. So yes, I often found that was my experience as well, Kevin.
Yeah. And just, with what you're now currently doing with EDI,
Yeah.
have you noticed that there's a shift in even the job description and how it's supposed to be written?
Yes, I mean, one of the sort of messages that I was really keen to get across here is that the move towards inclusion can, by some people, be seen as sort of quite a difficult and complex thing, and maybe even annoying in some cases. But what I always say about these sorts of scenarios is if you make adjustments to things, it benefits everybody. So spending time getting the job description right and making sure that it's very inclusive benefits everybody, because you then broaden the net by which you have possible candidates coming in. So really look at what your essential criteria is. I think sometimes we have essential criteria, and then if we ask ourselves if that's really necessary, the reality is it often isn't.
Mm.
So, for example, with the CIPD qualification, they might ask for a really high level of qualification, grade 7, when actually it's an entry level role. And so those sorts of things mean that your pool becomes smaller and smaller. So yeah, definitely seeing a change in how job descriptions are written, but also things like adverts as well. You sort of said the term there earlier, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get. And it's the same with adverts. If we constantly put our adverts out in the same places, you'll just keep getting the same type of people applying. So thinking really carefully about where you advertise and when you advertise and the groups that you're trying to target, but also thinking about things like the language, because it's very much the case. Research shows that people will deselect themselves based on the language that you use.
Mhm.
Often, for example, if you use the word dynamic, it tends to put off women applying as well in these situations. So thinking about the language that you use during your job adverts is very important. So taking an inclusive approach actually benefits everybody because it broadens out the group of people that you can appeal to.
And I'm sure you've noticed a bit of a trend as of late that lots of organizations claim that there isn't a lot of people out there that they can employ or look for. However, when I look at their job descriptions and their adverts, they have really narrowed their pool. And you're
Yeah,
absolutely right. They only put it in the same place because they potentially have a contract with this particular online provider, and they will only get the same people who go there. There-
absolutely.
Different platforms attract different people. It's not the sort of scattergun approach. It is more so about being specific, but in a general sense.
Yeah,
So there might be 3 or 4 platforms that you can put your posts onto. Okay, well, look at who visits each of those, because not everybody visits all 4. There'll be a particular person who
absolutely.
visits one and not another.
Yeah.
And that's where you then need to sort of really hone in on top of what you're trying to achieve. And I think a lot of organizations are sort of missing out on really, really good people. But it's interesting you talked about the language that's used
Yeah.
and dynamic. Now, I wasn't aware of that, and that's a real good takeaway. And I can understand now why potentially women would be put off by that. Is there any other particular wording and language that is used? I say used that potentially shouldn't be used because it will put off either a gender or an age or a particular qualification or whatever else.
Yeah, I mean, there are some things that are just automatically discriminatory. So even if you use things like young, enthusiastic, and dynamic, that is directly discriminatory. I'm What I would suggest is there's a lot of free websites you can use that actually analyzes your adverts and gives you an indication of whether it's um, um, discriminatory or not, or even just would influence a particular gender in a particular direction. But I think the whole point about inclusion is really important. And I'll give you an example, is that there are some people with neurodiverse conditions that will be put off if there isn't clarity around certain aspects. So one of the biggest debates, because you talked about somebody word vomiting, um, there may be people that as a result of their condition, that's them trying to manage and cope with that situation
Mm.
because they're under stress. So there's a whole debate at the moment about should you be giving interview questions in advance? And my answer to that is absolutely 100%. And I would offer it to all applicants. Um, and what I would say is the word that I want to get across to everybody that's listening is you might have heard of the words equality, diversity, inclusion. Equality is straightforward. It says we give everybody um, the same resources, but I want everybody to think of things in an equitable way. And I'll try and give a good example. I'll come back to the interview questions in a minute. But what equity means is, It's not about giving people an advantage. It's about bringing them up to a level playing field. And a good, very simple way of thinking about this is, if you hold your interviews up a flight of stairs in an office because it's got a beautiful view outside, but there is no lift, you are automatically preventing somebody who could perfectly well do the job but is in a wheelchair from even getting to the interview.
Yeah.
And what being equitable in your process means is leveling the playing field. So, are all of your interview rooms accessible? Are you automatically putting a barrier in place? So think about the location, and the accessibility of your interview rooms is a good example of being equitable in your approach. In terms of being equitable around people who are neurodiverse, some people need additional process time. So they're not able to answer a question spontaneously. Now, what I would say is that if your job requires a certain skill that requires to be quick and robust with a response, then that's understandable that that might form part of your selection process. But there are many jobs that don't require that. But if you don't, for example, offer the interview questions in advance to candidates, you are automatically preventing somebody from performing well at an interview who could do it really well. So there's an open debate about whether you should give the interview questions in advance to people who ask for it, or just automatically offering it. And I did a little bit of a test the last time I interviewed for somebody for my job, within my team, and I gave the interview questions to all of the candidates, and it doesn't give people an advantage. It just levels the level playing field. So I, in the end, offered the job to somebody who had ADHD, and they said they felt much better to able to articulate themselves in an interview, whereas before that, if they hadn't got the interview, they might have seemed as though they weren't able to respond or think of an example. So I hope that makes sense, but I would get the people listening to think about, is your interview process equitable? So that might apply to things such as the adverts. So, do you really need somebody who's working 5 days a week, 9 to 5? Or could you offer an element of flexible working, which means that you open it up to people who are carers? So again, another good example is, we had a number of carers who worked at my last workplace, and often they had to get their child who had a disability, to a specific school, which was often further away. It meant they couldn't get to work till 9:30. Why couldn't they start at 9:30? It was perfectly fine. So think about really think about why you are asking for a particular shift pattern, or why you are not allowing somebody to have the interview questions in advance. It's about just leveling the playing field. It's not about giving people an advantage. It's just about leveling the playing field.
That is really good advice. Absolutely great advice. I think some of the organizations where I currently am here in Northern Ireland have started to give the questions on the day of the interview on a page so they can be read.
That's a really good start. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a huge leap for some organizations.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And as I try to explain when I'm dealing with the organizations is, this isn't a memory test. If your organization needs a memory test, then let's do a memory test. But this isn't a memory test. This is, you want to see the best person. It's not. You want to see them, and you want to hear them, and you want them to do the very best, because then you can get on with your job.
Absolutely. And it's why I've never been a fan of the aggressive interview. I've always been sort of very encouraging during an interview process, for that reason, that I want to see the best. And also, not just doing an interview is really important for that reason, because some people are just good at interviews. Yep. So having a process that really reflects. So within higher education, getting somebody to do a small element of teaching, a 10-minute teach, or a presentation is really useful. But you're never going to rock up to a lecture with 5 minutes to go and not know to the subject. So sort of springing something on somebody and going, right, in 5 minutes time, I want you to do a presentation on, you give it them, a few days in advance, like you would know, so don't make a false situation. I think it's very much what you said is, what is it you're trying, what does this job require? And does my interview process really reflect that? So I'm getting the right person for the job.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of organizations getting that wrong at this
Yeah.
moment in time, have done for a long time, and will continue to until people like yourself and myself educate them in a different manner,
Yeah.
because they're missing out on some absolute diamonds out there
Yeah.
because people
Absolutely.
can't do an interview.
And the stats are out there. Unemployment rates for disabled people are significantly higher than able-bodied people. And why is that? It's because they perceive there to be barriers in place, or they don't feel that they can, they don't see themselves reflected in in the job or in the organisation they work for.
Yeah. And again, back to the adverts. I mean, even a simple picture can tell you about an organization. Is it all white middle-aged men, or is there a diversity within that picture in
Absolutely.
itself? Because
Yeah.
people will look at a picture and think, can I see myself there in that picture?
I was going to say beforehand and then thought I would save it for later, but you're absolutely right. You have to see it to be it.
Yeah.
And so it is very important.
Yeah. Now, I think you've been trying to veer me away from this very important question of why you're here today. And I think we're right at this moment in
Yeah.
time going to ask this question, because I'm sure this is going to be a good one. So, Justine, what was your worst job interview ever?
I have one that sticks in the mind for so many reasons. And interesting enough, it was a position that I was offered and I did get the job. But it was, I think, an interesting one to reflect on. I think the first reason is from an employer's perspective. I actually applied for this job via an agency and was initially rejected. And then 2 days before the assessment centre, I was rung by the agency in a panic because they appeared to have run out of candidates. And I was asked at short notice to go to an assessment centre. And I say that because I got the job, and that agency then got very well paid for rejecting me initially and then frantically asking me to go down to an assessment centre. And I spoke to them in total for about 30 seconds. So they probably got, a few £1,000s. And it's not because I don't believe good agencies exist. That's not the point to this. I think actually, my point is, I think as an employer, you have to work very closely with the agencies to ensure that you are working together along a process and you understand what's going on. But I just thought it was interesting that I was rejected straight away initially, and then I was successful later, and I effectively filled the gap. The assessment centre was fine, and I didn't have an issue with that, and I got put through to the second stage. But I think I've mentioned a number of times is I am a very values-based person, but also I am very risk adverse. But the reason I persisted with this interview process was their strategy. First line was, it's a people thing.
Hmm.
So I was thinking, oh, they really, really do focus on taking care of their people, and I think this potentially would be a good place for me. But I then rocked up for the second interview, which happened to be the day after their Christmas party. And we were in an glass-winded interview room in the middle of an open plan office. And the three of them admitted to being really hungover. And they kept interrupting and stopping me to go and ask for coffee to be brought in so that they could continue with the interview. They were in such a bad state. And at that point, I started to realize that maybe this wasn't the place for me. And it wasn't It's because I didn't feel as though they really cared about my experience, and I found myself apologising for their situation, and it just became really awkward. So I think it's from an employer's perspective, obviously it didn't reflect well on them, but you combine that with my risk adversity, and I ended up accepting a job that in my heart I knew wasn't right. And actually, they should have known, if they'd take the time to get to know me, that it wasn't right for me either. And from the day I joined, I started looking for another job. So they'd spent money on an agency, a lot of money. They had then invited me down for a two-stage process, not presented themselves very professionally. And because I was so risk adverse, I just took the job offer because it was the first one that came along. And it was the worst combination of a person who wasn't right for that company and a company that wasn't right for me.
Yeah.
And I left very, very quickly. So it was a very costly process for both of us.
Yeah. Because potentially you've missed another opportunity that was outside of what you were doing, and that's pretty awful to think that people have turned up hungover knowing that they had an interview. I think poor planning just initially would,
Yeah.
would come to my mind, and then just unprofessionalism secondly. And I'm sure the position you were going for, obviously going through an
It was a
agency,
senior role.
yeah, it was
Mhm,
a senior role.
mhm.
And this is how
Yeah.
they represent and
Yeah.
accept and set the standard and set the bar.
It was a big organization. It wasn't, a small one where, it was perhaps a little bit more informal. It was a really, a big organization. And ultimately the interview didn't reflect the reality of the culture that I found myself in. So I was led to believe it was a very people-focused organization, and it wasn't. It was ultimately bottom line focused with no people
Mm,
focus at all. And it was bad because I wasn't brave enough to say, I just need to wait a little bit longer. The
yeah,
right role will be around the corner. So I leapt to it, and they didn't represent themselves well. And as a result, gave me the job. And it wasn't right for either of us. It was, pretty much a disaster. So I think for me, it's a really good example of a candidate being really clear on what it is that they want, and an organisation through their process really reflecting what they want. Because, as you said, it's a two-way process. It
yeah.
really is.
And it has to be. It has to be that two-way process, because if you
Yeah,
if you take somebody on who is not right, but you take them on anyway because it's filling a gap, because you have
absolutely.
to,
Yeah,
then nobody's winning. Nobody is
not at
winning.
all. No, because they've lost an employee quickly, and they've paid out a lot of money to get me there in the first place. So it's a very, very costly process.
It is, and I think that there's organizations and companies out there that actually look at how much it costs to employ a member of staff,
Yeah,
and without using an agency, I think the UK is roughly about £4,500. Now
yeah,
those are some direct and indirect costs, but that isn't inclusive of lost sales and potential HR having to chip in with disciplinaries or grievances or whatever else, and then having to replace that person again in 6 months' time because their heart and soul really wasn't in it.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
just thinking about what you're saying there, if you had an opportunity to go back and tell Justine back then, what sort of advice would you give her, knowing what you know now?
Um, be brave and not be so risk adverse. And I know that's easy to say, particularly where money is concerned, because I didn't financially, because what had happened is I'd just taken redundancy from the previous organisation. So I did have a bit of a buffer,
Mm.
but I had never been out of work since I was 16. And I was totally focused on getting a job rather than getting the right job.
Ah,
And that was the key thing. So I would say, don't panic, and you've got to be really true. You've got to be really true to the type of organization you work for. I just left the first company that I'd spent 12 years with, which I'd grown up in, which was a marriage made in heaven. And I didn't have that security anymore, and I panicked. And I I sort of focused on getting a job, not getting the right job, not getting the right company, which
Mm.
is why when I left that company, I made sure I went back to fundamentally, I am a values based person. I have to find an organization that matches my values, and the job is what I want it to be. And I did. And I spent another 12 years at that last company. So, yeah, it's definitely don't panic. Um, the right thing will come along. Um, and yeah, I think those are the main words of advice. And yeah, don't see it as a job. I mean, you know, I understand not everybody is values driven, and so if money is the priority, that's absolutely fine. I would never. That was the highest paid job I ever had.
Mm.
Um, but I am in a very fortunate position where money doesn't have to be the most important thing for me. Having
Mm.
a job I enjoy and a company I enjoy working for is more important. So yeah,
That's wonderful, and really, really good advice. And you know, any of our listeners that are listening right now should take some of that advice on board.
yeah,
Yeah, if it's money that is your motivator, then so be it. But if it's not, if you're looking for something that you're going to have a great work-life balance, you're going to enjoy going to work, you're going to enjoy getting out of bed, you're going to not see it as a task or a chore. And we've all been in those jobs. We've
totally,
stood in there. You know, we've stood there when the second hand on your watch feels like it every second takes 10 minutes to move. We've all been
absolutely.
in those jobs. And you're right, you
And I
have to
think it's
find out. Go ahead.
no, sorry for interrupting, Kevin. I was just going to say that there are there's a lot of research at the moment that is showing that younger generations, the millennials and Gen Z, I think it's about 69% of them are more likely to be values based in their decision making than salary based in their decision making, which might stop people. So things like inclusion, despite how polarized we are as a society sometimes, particularly at the moment, younger generations do appreciate inclusive organizations, ones that are values driven. Sustainability is another reason. So salary isn't everything.
Yeah.
Your whole sort of culture can be a massive attraction tool for people.
Yeah, and I think a lot of organizations need to take that on board, and especially those organizations that have been around for a while and don't have the capacity mentally to adapt to that change. Once they
Yeah,
adapt to that change, they would be absolutely amazed and shocked at how big of a pool they actually have available to them, and really, really good workers there.
yeah,
People that want to be there. That is worth its weight in gold.
absolutely.
Someone that wants to be in an organization.
Yeah, 100%.
Justine, thank you very much for today. I'm just wanting to summarize exactly some of the points you made because I think they're really poignant and they're really useful for anybody listening here today. There's 3 points I really picked up on that I think would be beneficial. The first one is be very self-aware, and it's one of your greatest strengths, because how else are you going to know what type of organization or company that you want to work for if you're not sure what it is you actually hold dear to you, what you will be flexible on, and what you will not be flexible on. And I think it's a really good exercise to do that when you're first setting out. Now, you have to be realistic. There's no jobs or very little jobs out there that you're going to make £1 million a year in, and you're going to be the boss and you're 17 years of age. I'm not saying that that's not achievable, but it's rare. It's rare. I think you need to set your realistic goals when you go in there. They can be adjusted, they can be moved, the goalposts can be changed, but start with something. Just don't go in blindfolded. Secondly, it was be brave. Be brave. That's a very difficult thing to do. It's an easy thing to say, but it's a very difficult thing to do. And especially when you have that mentality that you had that you were going to get a job. And that brings us lovely onto the third point that you made. Focus on getting the right job in the right company. Now, if you'd said nothing else but those words today on this for our listeners, that I feel is one of the most important things that has been said on here today. Look for the right job. Have that in your head from the very beginning, and look for the right company that will complement each other. Because it's a relationship, it's a partnership. It's not them and us, it's a relationship. Justine, thank you very much for that. It's absolutely really enlightening. So if anybody here who's listening today wants to find out more about Justine and what Justine does, Justine, where can they reach out to you?
The easiest place is to search me on LinkedIn under Justine Gillespie, EDI professional, and that's how you know you've got the right person.
Perfect. Justine, thank you very much. It has seriously been insightful and inspiring for me to hear your story and some of the tales. And as I said at the very beginning, some of these are embarrassing and some of them are very unbelievable. And that one for me is a bit of both. That's a bit embarrassing and unbelievable. Not for you, but for them. For them. So Justine, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
No problem. Okay, everybody, look out for our next episode where we will hear more stories from behind the interview curtain. But until then, remember, on the other side of a successful interview is the life that you all deserve.
For more details about our guest, or if you would like to be a guest, go to www.interviewskillscoach.co.uk/myworstinterviewever, or find us on Facebook or LinkedIn. And remember, on the other side of a successful interview is the life you deserve.